Okay, class, we're gonna get into week number 7 here. Today, we're gonna talk about specifically victimology, some of those things that we need to kind of identify for domestic violence victims. So it's going to be real heavy on that. We've already talked a lot about the different crimes and protective orders and all that. So this is going to be all about victims and also some part about different sorts of arrests and such. So I've sent you guys along with you'll get quiz number 4. You're also going to get a couple handouts, specifically one on the cycle of violent behavior. We'll talk about it briefly, but this is more or less what it looks like. Okay. And then also, I've sent you a handout specifically on domestic violence victim follow-up. So things that we as police officers are required to give victims once we've completed our domestic violence investigation. We want to make certain they have proper resources and such so that they could also follow up and protect themselves. Okay? So anyhow, real quick about the cycle of violent behavior, we'll just talk about that real quick. Keep in mind that domestic violence doesn't just typically happen out of the blue. I guess it could, someone just has a really bad day maybe. But generally what happens is it goes through a 3-stage phase. More or less you have, you just get started in a relationship and everybody, oh, you're so cute, you're so funny, I love you, those sort of things, right? That's typically what we call a honeymoon phase, more or less. But then after a while, now this doesn't occur in healthy relationships, but you could begin something known as the tension building phase, and that's the first phase of this. During the tension building phase, you'll see read your handout real good, but you'll see the suspect or the abuser, they'll start getting angry at little things, hey, do you have to chew so loud, maybe you could lose a few pounds, just kind of edgy, mean things, a lot of mean statements, but no physical violence at this point. That's very important to note. Okay, they could become possessive and all of those things. Where have you been? You didn't answer your phone. So this sort of thing could qualify the person as being in the tension building phase. Of course, the next phase after that is what we call the battering phase. That's where actual violence or threats of violence occur. Actual threats of violence. Significantly. We're not talking about, hey, you better get home or else. We're talking about, hey, I'm going to kill you. Okay? But actual violence, it could be slapping, punching, hitting, striking, kicking, any of those things. Okay? Even the worst part, strangling, suffocation. Okay, so the battering phase is where actual violence occurs. Well, guess where it goes after the battering phase? Goes back to the honeymoon phase. Oh, I'm so sorry. We quarreled, we argued. Usually they're going to minimize, deny, and blame and say, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, and buy you a gift, bring you flowers, whatever it may be. And then that begins the stage of the honeymoon phase, the apology, and oh, I'm so sorry I did that. But then it just goes right back into the tension building phase. Okay, and this cycle could occur several times in one day or several times in a month or in a year. Okay, so understand the cycle of violent behavior. You want to make sure you know that. You'll need that to answer some questions and such. We want to talk a little bit about victim follow-up. That's the second handout I gave you guys. So victim follow-up is really important in any sort of domestic violence investigation. We as police officers are required to give the victim certain things. We have to let the victim know that they could be kept confidential in their police report. Okay, confidential. And we'll talk a little bit more about confidentiality in a little bit. but I want to get through this. Then we also want to let them know how the complaint warrant process works. That means if the suspect isn't there and we haven't made an arrest, we may decide, okay, we're going to basically submit an arrest warrant declaration, and that's going to go to the DA, and then the DA is going to send it off to the judge, and then a warrant will be issued for the suspect's arrest. That's if the suspect's left. Private persons arrest procedures. We're going to talk more specifically about that as well. This is something that we could have the victim complete for us. It's basically a private person's arrest. Now, we don't need this, but I'm going to explain to you in a bit why it's a good idea to, if you can, try to get the victim to buy in on it. Remember, it's not legally required. So anyhow, like I said, we'll discuss private persons arrest in a little bit. We want to explain to the victim how to acquire restraining orders in the restraining order process, and we've more or less discussed restraining orders in our prior lectures and such. But we want to explain to them how they can follow up and get those. We also, it's very important for us to explain domestic violence resources to them, specifically things like the availability of community shelters and other services. These are going to be like 1-800 numbers, 24-hour numbers that they could call if they have any questions at all about restraining orders or safe houses or victim advocacy, anything like that. So that's going to be very important. And then we also, at the very end, when we're done, one of the last things we want to give the victim is our business card, our police officer, detective business card. It should include our name, our ID number, and the case number to the report. And of course, the department's phone number. But it has to have our name, our badge number, our ID number, and the case number to the report. And they're going to use that so that they could follow up on the case if they need to. And then briefly on that victim follow-up, we talk about a police or civil standby. This is something we could do on even a domestic dispute. It doesn't have to be a domestic violence. But basically what we could do is we could stand by at the location for 5 minutes or so. We don't want to make it too much longer than that. Just enough time for one of the other parties, most often it'll probably be the suspect, but if the victim wants to leave, they could do that as well. But we're going to stick around just long enough for the person who decides to leave to get their essential items, things like ID, medicine, a change of clothes. What we won't do is we're not going to let a U-Haul trailer pull up, and we're not going to stand by for hours while they move their entire home. Okay? Just essential items is what we're going to do. And this is something that's required of us. We need to make sure that we stand by for several minutes so that one of these parties could go in. We could even escort them in and make sure they get their personal items that are very important, and then they could leave the location peacefully. Okay? All right, so I want to cover some more items here. Hope everyone's doing okay on the online format. I know I'm as I stated before, I much prefer to do these in person, but we're making the best out of what we have here, okay? So let's go back to private person's arrest. I want to discuss that a little bit more. Remember what we said. What is domestic violence all about? Why does a suspect commit domestic violence? To exert their power and control. That's the primary reason. A private person's arrest is not necessary. In fact, the California State Legislature has given us the authority as peace officers to make an arrest for domestic violence, not just for probable cause, but we could actually make an arrest based on reasonable suspicion. And the reason they've given us that authority is so that we can stop the violence that evening, that day, whenever it is. If only probable cause could result in arrest, then we would be limited. We wouldn't be able to help the victim out as much. But we can make an arrest based on reasonable suspicion. Now, the courts haven't changed. They still have a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So once the suspect goes to court, chances are he or she will be let off. But at least that evening we could stop the violence. Now, a private person's arrest, I always try to ask my victims, are you interested in signing a private person's arrest? And they'll say things like, well, I thought you were going to arrest him. And I am. And I'll tell them that. Oh, absolutely. I'm going to arrest this person. However, think about what it can do to help the victim. It helps the victim regain a certain amount of their power and control back in their own life. The document itself really doesn't have any legal value, except perhaps maybe to say, yeah, the victim was committed to making sure this suspect was arrested at this incident. That's about as much value as it has, but it's not legally required. We can make the arrest regardless. But again, it gives that victim just a little bit of their self back. Again, their power and control that's been stripped from them through a lot of this. Okay. So think about a private person's arrest, not necessary, but it sure does offer some level of maybe at least some mental effectiveness back to the victim, okay? Let's talk about arresting police officers. We talked a little bit about that last lecture. I want to get into it a little bit more, just so you guys know. This is a crime that police officers do commit. I mean, we are not we're not infallible. We do screw up, and so what happens if we do? What happens if we do arrest a police officer? There is no good guy discount. There is no buddy discount. We handle that arrest like we would any other person. In fact, if the person is armed, if this say, like me, I mean, I carry my weapon when I'm off duty pretty much all the time. And that's because we're considered, a lot of us, especially with like city and county police departments, are considered law enforcement officers 24 hours a day. So if I'm going anywhere, I have my gun on me. Okay. Now, what happens if an officer is arrested and they have a firearm on them? Then the arresting officer, or the officer showing up to the scene to handle the report, should literally take or remove that firearm from the suspect officer. Should be the first thing that happens. Okay, of course we want to do it safely and all of that, but we're gonna take that firearm from the officer. One thing we absolutely should do right away is notify our own supervisor. Hey, Sarge, need to let you know I just arrested a currently employed police officer. I've just taken his gun. He committed a felony domestic violence against his wife. Just want to give you a heads up. The third thing that'll happen after you make the arrest, just like you would anyone else. We don't give any good guy courtesy here. The second thing is we're going to take the firearm from them. Absolutely, we have to, or any other weapons they may have. The third thing is we're going to notify our own supervisor. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure our department contacts that offending officer's department. They need to know. Because if we don't say anything, then theoretically or logically, he could just get another firearm and go back on duty. We want to prevent that. This person at least needs to go through the court process, legal process, to make sure they're fit for duty. Okay? So make sure you understand that. Something that does happen every once in a while, it's infrequent, but we have a large military base out here in Riverside, March Air Force Base. What happens if you arrest a currently active military member? Okay, so what I tell people is it all depends on where. Okay, if this person, this military member, active duty military member, Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, commits domestic violence on their base, on their military base, then that's going to be up to the military police to handle. We, as local police, city police, county police, don't have jurisdiction or authority unless we're granted some level of that, which is very rare. The military will have their own police, and they will handle that arrest as defined in their laws, which is not dissimilar to the local and state authority. Now, what happens if they commit this active duty military member commits domestic violence at a bar in town, in the city or in the county, off base? Then generally the local laws are going to take effect. That means that we'll arrest them per the state laws. The county or the city municipal police will arrest them for the state laws at 273.5 or 243.1. What happens if military police show up at the jail and say, hey, this is our guy, we're taking him into custody? No, it doesn't work that way. I've never seen that, but let's just say for argument, that military member is in our custody, in our county, in our local jurisdiction. If there are times where you could have a level of what they call an informal agreement between the military police and the suspect's commanding officer, those don't count. Who cares about informal agreements? Now, if there is ever, and I've never seen or even heard of it, a formal agreement where, say, like the city chief of police or county sheriff has a written formal agreement with a military base commander, then that's different. Okay, but we don't honor informal agreements. We don't do that. Okay, simply said, we're gonna handle this case just like we would with anyone else's case. Okay, so make sure you understand that. Oh, let's see. How about dual arrest? This is something that comes up every once in a while. The California State Legislature discourages dual arrest. What that means is we have a husband and wife. Husband punches a wife in the face. Wife punches a husband in the face. Okay, really what we have are two separate acts of domestic violence. Okay, now why would the legislature discourage it, but doesn't outlaw it, just simply discourages it? They discourage it because they say if you arrest both parties, nothing's going to happen. You can't have a victim and a suspect at the same time. So what we try to do is we try to look through the case, we try to examine the facts of the case, and we define the most significant aggressor. Okay, so that's very important to know. Not the primary, the most significant aggressor. So say my wife slaps me on the back of my head, and then I do a flying side kick to the side of her face and a couple of her teeth go flying out. Okay? Her level of force was so far below mine that I should be the one to go to jail. Even though she hit me first, I should be the one to go to jail because I was the most significant aggressor. Okay? So we want to think about those things. Now we write the report just like it happened. Yeah. And theoretically, again, if she slaps me on the back of my head, yeah, that is a misdemeanor domestic violence because no injury occurred. But that doesn't give me the right to simply, kick her on the side of the face and make her lose teeth and such, okay? So we're going to look at injuries in these sort of cases. We're going to try to do our best not to make a dual arrest. We're not saying we can't. And, I always say it's like at the end of Rocky 2, Apollo Creed and Rocky Balboa are in the gym. They're all by themselves. And at the very end of the movie, it cuts off right when they both throw a punch at each other with the exact same force, the exact same effect at the exact same time. Maybe in those situations we can make a dual arrest. But generally, we're going to try to find the most significant aggressor. So pay attention to that, specifically injuries and such. Okay? The last thing I want to talk about is victim confidentiality. Remember, we mentioned that on the victim follow-up. So 293 of the Penal Code talks about a victim's right to confidentiality. We also hear it called Marsy's Law, M-A-R-S-Y, apostrophe S, Marsy's Law. And what this says is that there are certain violent crimes where a victim can be held, basically kept confidential in the police report. That means if the press or the public tries to acquire a copy of that police report, they will not see the victim's name or information. That information is placed in a more secure location just for the prosecutor and the court. This protects the victim's rights. Okay. Now, victim confidentiality under 293 doesn't occur with like property crimes. Okay, who cares? I mean, I hate to say it that way, but a property crime's a property crime, and the press and the public can gain access to that report if you're a victim. So if you're a victim of a burglary, if you're a victim of trespassing, those things are property crimes, more or less, and they are not crimes that would allow a victim to be kept confidential in the police report. However, what about domestic violence? Absolutely. Domestic violence is a crime of violence. Okay? So a victim can decide that they want to keep their name confidential in the police report if they are a victim of domestic violence. What about things like stalking? Yeah, there's another one. Stalking, 646.9 of the Penal Code. A victim can be kept confidential in the police report because stalking is a particularly violent type of crime that the victim often fears, one of the requirements. What about rape? I mean, absolutely. Yeah, rape is a terrible violent crime, and the victims should certainly be able to be kept confidential in that police report. Things like child molestation as well. Absolutely, we want the victim to be kept confidential if they choose, okay? So anyhow, remember, confidentiality in a police report only deals with violent crimes. Non-violent crimes, trespassing, shoplifting, burglary, things like that, they won't apply. That would not make you eligible for victim confidentiality. Okay? All right, guys, keep watching the lectures. Keep paying attention to the handouts. We're on the final stretch here. We need you guys to keep pushing through. I want to see everybody do really well. I would love for everyone to get an A in my class. That would make me very happy. So anyhow, that's all for now, and we'll see you on the next lecture. Thank you.